So, welcome. And yes, as Julian just said, I finished my PhD last year in May at the University of Gothenburg with main supervisor Fabien Roquet. But you all can imagine there is a lot of other collaborators involved in this work. And I'm going to walk you through not all of my thesis, but parts of it, especially the ones using NEMO. And yeah, the title of my thesis was on the generation of Mordrei's polynyas in the Weddell Sea. And as we've heard a lot of Northern Hemisphere stuff, we're now going to the Southern Hemisphere. If my computer allows me to change slides. Yeah, so if we go to the Southern Hemisphere and we're looking at the sea ice in the summer and winter, for example, from 2023, what you see here on the right is, on the left, you see the summer, and you see like the partial ice cover. But you probably are all familiar with the sea ice cover we see in winter, which is here on the right side, with a lot of sea ice cover. And we have like that whole Antarctic continent surrounded by sea ice. But if we all go 50 years back in time, with the time where we had the first satellite observations of this region, you notice that instead of a fully encircled sea ice cover around the Antarctic Ocean, we have an area here in the north around the prime meridian where the sea ice concentration is low. And this is what we refer to as a polynya. So a polynya is an open area of sea ice in the winter season. But we probably all heard Jonathan's talk, which was talking about coastal polynyas, but this one is an open ocean polynya. So those two are occurring at different locations. And as the schematic here on the right shows, the coastal polynyas are close to the coast, while the open ocean polynyas are further offshore. And if the ice is opening up, we see that we have a lot of exchange of heat and carbon dioxide between the atmosphere and the ocean, because the barrier of the sea ice is gone. And if the polynya is opening up, we lose the heat, so we form a lot of dense water. So in the coastal polynyas, the dense water is formed on the shelf and going into the deeper ocean. In the open ocean, we have like a cold, fresh layer on top above a warm, salty layer. And with the upwelling of the warm layer, we bring heat to the surface, melting this polynya and forming dense water, which is going down. One main difference besides the locations of these two polynyas are that coastal polynyas are occurring quite regular due to like winds pushing the ice off the coast, while the open ocean polynyas are occurring a lot more irregular. But if they occur, we can form a lot of Antarctic bottom water and shortcut like this normal formation way on the open ocean, on the coastal polynya. So now we're going into the Weddell Sea, and the schematic here you see, or the figure you see here on the right, is zooming into the Weddell Sea. The blue arrows are showing like, or schematizing the wind-driven Weddell gyre circulation, which is bringing warm and saline, high carbonated warm deep waters into the region. And you probably notice here where the yellow arrow is pointing that the Weddell gyre is splitting up into two limbs, and one is going around in the north here, around a seamount, which is called Mordrei's. So one part of the title of the thesis. And Mordrei's is a seamount in the Weddell Sea located at 2 degrees east and 65 south. And as you see here on the bathymetry on the right, it's like off the coast, surrounded by a flat abyss, and suddenly there is a seamount rising to 2,000 meters. Coming back to this polynya event in 1974, which is an open ocean polynya, this one was followed by two more events in 1975 and 1976. And they are quite big and occurring in the Weddell Sea, so that's referred to as Weddell Sea polynyas. But in the following years after 1976, there were no Weddell Sea polynyas since then. And then 2016 and 2017 came. And as you can see here on the sea ice schematic, we see smaller openings. They are smaller compared to what we've seen. They were not as long-lived as the ones in the 70s, but they were polynyas. And since they are smaller, they are referred to as Mordrei's polynyas. So these polynyas, Mordrei's polynyas, are quite important because, like, if we compare locations of the ones in 2016 and 17. So here we are again in a zoom in of the Weddell Sea. Mod Rise is here. We see in blue and orange the polynyas from 2016 and 2017. And in the red line, the opening of 1974. And we've seen that the 1974 expanded and outgrew into these big polynyas in 1975 and 76. But since those three occurred at the one location, the question is, why are polynyas occurring at Mod Rise? And therefore, we need to look at the hydrography in the region. So here on the right, you see a climatology, and in black, you see the isobath of the region. Mod Rise is here in the center of this plot, and we're looking at the subsurface temperature maximum below the mixed layer. And probably one thing you will notice that at the flanks of Mod Rise, we have like almost fully encircled a ring of warm water, by 1.5, depending on the region where you work. And so this region, the warm water goes along with a shallow mixed layer depth and is referred to as warm water halo. And you probably also noticed that on top of Mod Rise, there is this colder spot here, around like 0.5 and less degrees temperature. And this goes along with a deep mixed layer depth. And this region is referred to as Taylor Cap. And in this talk, I'm gonna try to bring some understanding of the preconditioning and formation processes of these polynyas to you, and we also will look into modeling aspects. But the work on the polynya comes with quite some challenges. So the Southern Ocean is not a region where we can go easily and do a lot of observations. So this is here again, like all the profiles available from 2007 to 2022. And from the database of EN4 and a couple of ship-based observations. And you probably see that it's not a lot of data, not much spatial coverage. So that's one issue if you try to understand an event which you can't predict when it's happening. And the other thing is polynyas and models. A couple of the short talks before touched on this, that, for example, these polynyas are not well reproduced. So here on the right, we see a study of the CMIP6 groups by Martin Moorman. And probably you can't read the names of the models in the back row, but that doesn't matter, because you always see the Antarctic continent in the center. In the blue and white colors, you see the mean sea ice concentration, and in red and yellow, the probability of polynya occurrence. And the main difference you see between the models is that for example, in the upper row, you see some models with a lot of red indicating there are polynyas occurring, but quite big. And if you look in the second row, you don't see any red, so there is no polynyas occurring. So this study summarized that if you have a polynya, it's either too frequent or you don't have a polynya at all. And also these spatial scales of these are very, very poorly estimated. And yeah, this also is connected to like spurious deep convection in the models. So based on on the studies, on the models, on the data we have available, studies suggested like different mechanisms for forming these polynyas. The first one was surface forcing, like cyclonic winds. The second one is like topography and flow interactions, like the interaction of the Weddell Gyre with Mod Rise. Then due to the stratification in the region, convective and vertical instabilities might play a role, or also studies propose a combination of those. And to refine the aims, I divided the talk into two parts. The first part will be about which processes are important for the preconditioning of these polynyas before 2016. And the second question is, how do technical choices affect the generation of polynyas in ocean and ice models? And what are important processes for the polynya formation? And throughout this talk, I've been using 3 different data sets, or 4. So one is the GLORIS 12 reanalysis, and then I developed 2 regional configurations. And the available observations of these regions. Starting with GLORIS 12, probably all of you have encountered GLORIS by now, but it's a global NEMO configuration running from 1993 to today on a 1/12 horizontal resolution, and it's assimilating data from satellites. Then coming to the regional configurations, probably the main part of my PhD, also the main headaches of my PhD. So here in the upper plot, we see the Weddell Sea, and the red box here is indicating the domain of my regional configuration. And the bathymetry is what you see here in the zoom in. So in the center of this configuration is MODRISE. That's also how I ended up with the name mod 12 and mod 36. And the numbers are indicating the horizontal resolution of 1/12 and 1/36. And at the open boundaries, we used GLORIS, and also we started from initial temperature and salinity fields from GLORIS 12. And the atmosphere is used or forced by JRA, and we're running a hindcast from 2007 to 2017 to really have the possibility to look at what's happening before the polynya. And briefly repeating about the observations, so it's the EN4 database combined with MODNES. It's a cruise from 2005 and data from the Sochi cruise in 2022. Coming to the first question, so the answer of this question was addressed in the first study I've been publishing in 2023 with collaborators. And so we're starting to look at this in a timeline, and we notice in the region of MODRISE in 2013 and 14 the advection of cold, fresh, deep waters into the region. So the most important plot is here, the one on the right. So it's looking at the subsurface, so 200 to 1,000 meter mean density at different locations. So each color line here is referring to a location in the model domain. And if we look at the time here on the x-axis, we see in the beginning the density in this region in the subsurface is quite similar, but then there is a drop in 2013. And it starts at the blue location, so in the eastern part of the domain, and then it's slowly commuting through to the red location, to the black, to the yellow, and even parts of this water mass ending up on MODRISE. And so this is the start of the polynya processes I've identified so far. And then we're coming to the years 2015 and 16, and all models show that we have an accumulation of heat below the mixed layer. So here on the right, you see the hydrography, which we've seen in the climatology of observations, where you have the halo wrapping around MODRISE, and the Taylor cap very distinguishable on top. But if we look, for example, in the year 2014, you don't really see this pattern anymore. And if we make a spatial comparison over the time, how these regions vary, we look at the temperature in the 3 different models. So in GLORIS, you see in the blue line, in mod 12 in orange, and mod 36 in the red line, and also the observations in the regions. We see that all models start around 2007, around half a degree. They all warm up till 2013, 2014. We see a slight dip where the cold fresh water is advected in, but then we're recovering back to 1 degree. And what the models show is quite comparable to what we see in the observations. Of course, the models are a little bit smoother because we have everywhere data, and the observations are a little bit spread over the region. But now, if we look at the observations for the Taylor cap really on top of MODRISE, where the polynya is opening up, we start in 2007, where we have a quite cold Taylor cap. And then we sadly don't have any observations between 2010 and 2013. But the models indicate a warming. And in 2016, where the polynya is opening up, the observations we have show that it's quite warm there as well. So the temperature has risen in that region. And as you can see, the polynya is opening up. The observations on top of MODRISE are cooling down, as well as GLORIS 12 is doing it. You probably also see that mod 12 and mod 36 are still warm, And this is why this study ended in 2016, because we didn't open up a polynya, and also the polynya wasn't opened just because we have higher resolution. And this is bringing me to the second question of this talk. How do technical choices affect the generation? And what are the important processes? And this was something recently, half a year ago, published in James. And I'm gonna walk you through it. So one part of the technical choices we looked at was convective mixing. So probably you all know that our models often use something called enhanced vertical diffusion. So meaning that if you have a grid cell which is negative, has a negative n squared, has a negative buoyancy frequency, we're assigning large eddy coefficients, and then we're mixing the grid cells above and below. But if we're thinking back about convection in reality, you probably all think about like plumes going from one level to deeper levels and penetrating through the water column. So not exactly the same of what EVD is doing. So we used a scheme developed by Giordani et al. In 2020, which is called eddy diffusivity mass flux parameterization. And this scheme is producing convective plumes on a subgrid scale process and is trying to reproduce convection similar to what is done in the atmosphere. So an example of this is the schematic here on the right. So you have one grid cell and several vertical layers. And within this grid cell, you have like a convective area where you start your plume. And in this convective area, you have a different density, which is higher than outside the plume. So in the gray area, the density is higher while compared to what is in the white. And due to this density difference, you get like a downdraft and bringing water through the next vertical layer until the density in the plume is comparable to what you see outside. So we used this scheme, and we also modified it to allow for thermobaric instabilities. And in the first step, I ran the model from 2007 to 2017 using those three different options, like the EVD, the EDMF, and the modified EDMF. And here on the right, you see climatologies of temperature and salinity from observations in the upper two plots. And the black line is like the climatological mixed layer depth. But in the lower six plots, so you see the difference between the experiment using EVD, EDMF, and the modified EDMF minus the observations. We see in temperature, in temperature there is a positive and negative signal, so it's okay. And the mixed layer is quite comparable in all runs. But if you look at the salinity, you see that the salinity is throughout the whole climatology too fresh. And so I've been looking back into the model of why is my domain far too fresh. And I found that I have an ice accumulation in the domain, probably due to the open boundaries, but also due to precipitation from my forcing. Because if you compare like ERA 5 and JA 55, you see they differ quite a lot in what they prescribe for these regions, but no one knows because we don't have enough observations. So to tackle this excessive freshwater, we continued with some freshwater experiments, sensitivity experiments. Don't be scared of the plot yet. So we continued after 2011 by reducing our freshwater to like partials of what we've used before. Like we had some runs with 0% precipitation of the original forcing, then 10%, 20%, 30%, and 40%. And so you see here on the right, so the different precipitation runs and the different years on the y-axis, 2012 in the top and 2017 at the bottom. And the color is showing the number of days with a CS concentration below 20% as indicator of a polynya occurrence. And from the satellite observations, we know that we are expecting a polynya event in 2016, which is occurring at mod rise, and an event in 2017, which is even stronger than what we see in 2016. but we don't expect any polynya events occurring in 2015 or 14. So if we compare to our observations to what we see in the model, we see that this 20% run shows like the best similarities to our observations. And therefore we started to look at analyzing it regarding the polynya triggering processes. Before that, I'm gonna briefly show you a comparison of observations, satellite observations of the polynya and the model output. So in the upper row, you see snapshots from the satellite, and in the lower row of the model. One thing you probably notice if you compare like the times, the model is producing the polynya quite earlier. For example, in 2016, there is an offset by a week. But at some point, the patterns are very comparable. And in 2017, the polynya opened in the model quite early. But after a couple of days, the patterns are very comparable. And this is probably due to differences in nonlinearities due to the forcing. And probably models are also not perfect. So if we compare the opening of the sea ice to where the model is starting deep convection, because the opening is really connected to deep convection, we see that the model is starting to deep convect at like single red dots on the plot here. And the dashed line is indicating where the sea ice is opening up in red for 2016. And we see that the model is deep convecting where we see it in the satellite observations. And the same for 2017, so the model is deep convecting on the east of Moderise, and also the opening occurs slightly to the east of Moderise. And one thing we started to see, to look at, is if the patterns of the deep convection events are comparable or if they differ and have different characteristics. So one thing we noticed, we're looking in the upper plot at the time lag, so the difference between how many days has it taken for the model to deep convect at this one location. So if it's blue, meaning that it's after the onset of deep convection, it's maybe 1 or 2 days. If it's yellow, it's meaning like it's 80 days after the onset of deep convection that it convected at this location. And in the lower plot, you see how long this grid cell has been deep convecting. And yellow is indicating like it's been a very brief deep convection event, and brownish is showing that it's been convecting there for a long time. So in 2016, the deep convection event started here on the northern flank and then spread towards the east, where it's here manifesting itself, indicated by the brown colors here at the bottom. But if we're looking at 2017, so it started here and suddenly it spread all over the region of Moderise. And where it's also manifested itself is also where we had the opening of the polynya. So the characteristics of these two events are quite different. And we had the idea that it's different processes at play to lead to this formation. So starting off, we looked at the plume properties, so the plume velocity of the EDMF scheme. And we looked at like the spatial average in the two regions where the deep convection set on. So this is what we're seeing here on the left, in the lower plot. We're seeing the spatial mean, and the red color is indicating that the scheme was active, that we had like some convection plume going on. The gray line is our mixed layer depth, and we're seeing that here at the depth of 250 meters roughly, where the cold fresh surface layer is interacting with the warm salty layer below, we always had quite some mixing occurring. And also, especially before the deep convection set on, we saw quite some activity. While if we compare to the pattern in 2017, where below the mixed layer depth, there was no mixing going on at all. And as a second step, I looked at like horizontal properties of the region, and the plot which just appeared are like the salt deficit. So it's a measurement of stratification in the region, expressed like in how much additional sea ice growth you need to overturn the water column. And one thing you see that in 2016, the colors are a little bit more green. So it's indicating that you would have needed like sea ice or additional salt input at the surface level to start overturning. While in 2017, the region around Moderise is really wide, indicating that the stratification was very, very weak, while it was in 2016 only weak. And as a last step, we looked like where is the salt coming from, which we needed to overturn the region. And we're looking at the surface salt anomaly here in 2016 in plot E, and in 2017 in the lower right plot. One difference you see is that there is only a weak advection of salt anomaly into the region where the deep convection appeared and the polynya opening appeared, while in 2017 we have a strong advection into the region. So to summarize this, we had like a polynya in our model, which was enabled by instabilities at depth and a weak and ambient stratification in 2016. But the long deep convection event in 2016 preconditioned the region for the polynya in 2017. And this one was enabled by an advection of surface salt anomaly. Probably a lot of you have the question also, like, how did the choice of mixing scheme and the freshwater forcing respond? So we repeated this run with 20% precipitation, but using like the EVD scheme here on the left, top left, the original EDMF scheme and the one I showed the results from, which is here in the lower right. And we're looking at the maximum mixed layer depth in 2016. And one thing you probably will notice is that the patterns between the EDMF schemes and the EVD scheme are quite different. Like with EVD, you deepen like the mixed layer in the whole region, while in EDMF, with EDMF, the deep convection patterns are very localized. And also with this localized deep convection patterns, we have very localized polynyas, while we don't have proper polynyas in the EVD scheme run. And lastly, to conclude everything with this work, we have shown that for forming polynyas, we have quite a long list of processes at play to get these events reproduced. And also we could point that things are happening at least a couple of years ahead of the opening. And also that getting the models right, or we need a lot of fine tuning for parameters and forcing, but it's in general possible to produce a polynya. And yeah, that's it. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much for this presentation. So we're there at this crossing between physics and modeling, which is probably interesting for many people here. So we have about 15 to 20 minutes for question and answer, if that's okay. And both for people online and people in the room, starting with people in the room. Don't hesitate to send a message online if you want to ask a question.
Thank you. Very interesting. I'm of course interested in the modification leading to thermobaric instability. Could you elaborate on how you did that exactly?
So the EDMF scheme in the original version is using potential density, and we changed it in the scheme to use in situ density. So you would have, yeah.
Okay, that's simple. All right.
There's another one there.
Yes, thank you for the presentation. I had a question about EMF. Like, I know it's pretty used in the atmosphere because they have to do vertical advection implicitly, because you have like high vertical velocities. But I was wondering if you found less stability when using it in the ocean, because typically we do EVD, we do it implicitly, but it might be a little bit more difficult to do implicitly vertical advection if you have a lot of nonlinearities in the terms that you have to calculate in EDMF.
So I could see that EDMF has an impact on the stratification, especially below the mixed layer depth.
So is the model as stable as with EVD with EDMF? Or do you have to like reduce the time step, or do you have to do some some nonlinear solve?
When running with EDMF, I had to reduce the time steps slightly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for a nice presentation. So my question is two-part to some extent. So you mentioned that something like ERA 5 would look much different in terms of precipitation than JRA 55. Did you try to run with ERA 5? And if so, is there a big difference? Do you get the same kind of activity? And sort of extending on that as well, like what kind of difference would it make if you run fully coupled, like have a fully coupled atmosphere as well?
Okay, so in some part of developing this regional configuration, I've run with ERA 5, but using EVD scheme, and the results were comparable, like no polynya at all. About the coupled, I haven't tried it at all, so I don't know the answer. Probably, yeah, no. Sorry.
One hypothesis is that if you're not coupling with an atmosphere, you basically have an infinite heat capacity in the atmosphere, right? So you keep on fluxing out a lot of heat from the ocean to the atmosphere, and that basically sustain the polynya activity in itself until the warm deep water is depleted. So in a lot of these model simulations, you end up with polynyas that are much bigger and they last a lot longer. Yeah. But it would be interesting to see if that's the case as well when you're going to higher resolutions and with better mixing schemes as well.
Yeah, so one thing the observation has shown, like that the region of model ice in general has cooled after the polynya event, but since I haven't run the model with coupled, yeah.
Any other question in the audience? I was very naively wondering if we were like getting an idea of the so here in your case, if we want to get an idea of whether some specific choices in vertical mixing or forcing can improve or affect negatively the representation of this preconditioning mechanisms, we need to run the entire model. Do you think that it would be possible to get like a 1D vertical column model, and that could be informative? Or another way to turn it is, to what extent would the lateral fluxes be key in the setup of the certification and the preconditioning here?
So I'm not sure if 1D would work, because especially on the flanks on the northern side where you advect Weddell gyre water, you have quite high velocities and a lot of lateral advection that properties don't stay there long enough to probably work. So yeah, you would need to find a solution there. But, yeah.
So thank you for this very, very interesting talk. So I have two questions, actually. So the first one is, you mentioned that you were accumulating sea ice in your domain. So how did you solve? I mean, could you comment a little bit? Was that linked with your boundary conditions? What kind of boundary conditions? And then how did you fix the problem?
So at the open boundary conditions, I used GLORIS 12 to be bringing sea ice into my domain, and it seemed that I imported more from the boundary conditions than I exported. Like, I made a freshwater budget of just what I've been adding in the region, and in the end I had quite some differences in PSU over my whole simulation time. And the only way to if the ice melts in the region, you add freshwater, so that's why we reduced the freshwater precipitation to compensate for the additional heat, additional freshwater. The other option probably would have been reducing the sea ice we bring in by the boundary conditions of GLORIS.
Okay, so the sea ice was kind of relaxed at the boundary, and you had also an open condition for sea ice, but this means that, okay, Gloris has assimilation, so Gloris, yeah, I don't understand, because Gloris didn't accumulate the sea ice, so how come you accumulated it?
Yeah, it seemed like, yeah, I brought more in, and the thing is, Gloris, since it's assimilating, we're not sure, like, the sea ice thickness we're bringing into the region is actually what we have in the Weddell Gyre. So measurements of sea ice thickness is also quite crucial.
Okay. And then my second question is, I mean, you have proposed, you have tested improvements in regional models, but as you have shown, there are some problems like that in the CMIP models, and even at high resolution coupled model also have these problems. So, I mean, let's say, let's assume I'm Malcolm Roberts from the Met Office, and he has this 1/12 of degree coupled NEMO simulation with a huge polynya in the Weddell Sea. How would you advise him to what could he do to get rid of it? Because there is no boundary condition to play with. So, I mean, would you advise something specific, or?
Well, I would guess, like, try and see if it's working using EDMF. But yeah, I guess talking to Romain and Violin, who's running this in a global model, could probably help.
Okay.
Thanks a lot.
Excuse my ignorance, but I'm curious about, I mean, those seamounts in the Southern Ocean. There is one I know a little bit about, is Zapiola. And one of the few things I've heard about this animal is that it's trapping water masses very efficiently on top of the bump. You were showing some advection from the north or from the northeast, so that it doesn't, while the dimension of the mountain seems to be kind of similar, you mentioned cap, which was suggesting that there was trapping, I mean, isolation of some water mass there, but you were at the same time talking about external influences. I just want to know if you have an idea about whether those two structures have very different porous character.
Yeah, so one part is that this Taylor cap or Taylor column we see at Morais is not a permanent one where you really have an isolated spot of water properties on top. You have something which has been referred to as viscous Taylor cap. So it's trapping water temporary for a couple of months, but then some flushing can appear and you change the properties. So you don't isolate the properties for very long in that region. And yeah, that's the main difference.
Okay.
Any other question in the audience? I think there's no question online. Let me check again. Nope. So I think we can break here, and thank you again for this great presentation, Birte.
Thank you.